Now, I made a film about GarageBand effects, was Bit Crusher and Chorus and Flanger, and they're fantastic effects, all really editable and add so much to your mix. There is a second set, however. Now, I'll just show you how to access those because they're not there by default. If we go to Settings and GarageBand, here we go, GarageBand. There is an option saying Enable iOS Effect Plugins. Make Apple iOS Effect Plugins available to your GarageBand projects. And you think, well, why would you switch those on? Why don't you just have them on all the time? Well, they're quite memory intensive, and you'll see why when we start getting into the real nitty-gritty. So if your iPad is a little bit older, maybe they won't work so well. Or you basically, if you add too many, it'll make the thing crash. Now, going into GarageBand, I've got a song here with some drums and bass on, and I'm going to record a little bit of acoustic guitar, just 4 bars, because these audio units, these effects plugins, the other set, really are a sort of corrective tool. You can use these to address problems that you might be experiencing with some of your tracks, and I'll explain that. So I'll just quickly stick down 4 bars of chords. Okay, here we go. Okay, there we go. There's my acoustic guitar. Now, let's have a listen to that. Now I rehearsed the chord sequence and I got it basically the other way around. So just make sure that that is there we go. Okay, fine. Let's just change the bass notes to match the guitar chords. Yeah, slightly unorthodox. So, now we've got that acoustic guitar recorded. I've recorded it using the internal mic on a particular guitar in a particular room. It's not always going to work out that the recording is perfect or exactly what you want. Now, all these acoustic factors come into play. So, let's start having a look through some of these effects. For my money, the guitar just needs a bit more body. It's just a bit sort of weedy. Could just do with a bit more oomph, whatever that is. Now, under the plugins and EQ banner, we have a range of options dictated by your menu on the left here. We've got the noise gate and a compressor and a visual EQ, and then we've got these 4 blocks into which you can insert any effects. Now, yesterday, when I made that video about the effects, they're all on here, overdrive, microphaser, and you think, oh, okay, fine. And you can buy more on the App Store. You can just keep adding effects. Audio unit extensions is the second pane of effects here, and you're met with this sort of rather uninspiring set of orange blobs. And when you open them up, you think, it doesn't look very exciting. I shan't bother with those. However, I'm going to go through a couple of these to show you how you can wake that guitar up a bit. We've got the sort of visual EQ in GarageBand, which can address most issues, but there are some very, very much more advanced features here. Now, let's start. I'm not going to demo them all because some of them are effects. So I'm just going to mostly deal with the EQs. So bandpass filter. I'm actually going to look at the dynamics as well. Bandpass filter is the first one in your list. So when you play it back, think, what's it done? So let's go on the orange button and find out. Only 2 controls here. We've got a frequency and bandwidth. Just before we start, frequency, 20 Hertz is the lowest frequency that we can technically hear, and 20,000 is the highest that we can hear, and that degrades over time. The actual frequency, the top frequency on here, 22,050. You think, well, what's that about? Why is it that figure? Slightly bizarre. Well, if you double that, you get 44,100, which is the sampling frequency of the audio processor on GarageBand, and that is also the CD standard. You think, oh, why does it need to be that? Well, if you've got a 22,000 hertz signal like that, in order to store that and replicate it, you need to sample the top of the wave and the bottom of the wave. So you need to have 2 samples per cycle, which is why your sampling frequency needs to be double the maximum frequency that you can hear. And then we've got bandwidth. And this is measured in cents, 600 cents, $6, €6. There are 100 cents in a semitone, which means there are 1,200 cents in an octave. So if we have, we start at 1,200 cents perhaps, just got a message through there. This is 1 octave's worth. Now, I'm going to vary the frequency here, and then I'm going to, well, you can hear what it sounds like. Basically, it's only allowing through a certain band of frequencies, hence the term band pass. So you've got, if that's your 0 line of no change, basically it's doing this with a peak. So it's allowing basically a load of frequencies through. And in fact, it's only allowing if that's a 0 line, that is no boost or cut. The band pass is actually doing that with the band at 0. So it doesn't boost anything, it simply allows a certain amount through. So it has limited usage, but you can create effects with it. If I was to maybe do that, for example, I could say, oh, okay, well, I'm going to duplicate this track, take away the bandpass filter on the duplicated track, copy that, replicate the guitar part down there. So if I just solo these out. There's the affected one. Now, the affected one, I could say, oh, okay, well, I'm going to stick a phaser or something, or overdrive, perhaps. Let's see what happens with that. I mean, that sounds pretty dreadful, but it might add something to that acoustic guitar track, the straight through one. So I've used that as a bit of an effect as well, or a bit of a sort of, just experimentation. That's the thing with Apple products and the GarageBand, is that you can experiment with stuff. It doesn't constrict you. You can do anything. Anyway, I'm going to get rid of that track, or rather I'll just mute it for now. So going back to this one, just take everything off apart from the bandpass filter. I'm going to move on now to the next thing down the list. So if you go to edit, I'm just going to take overdrive away, just leave everything out apart from the audio unit extension that we're playing with. Audio unit delay is a delay time. It's a delay line. And you can address this in GarageBand itself, in the other effects. However, there is a difference here, and I'll just briefly go through that. I did say I wasn't going to go through this, but actually I am. The delay time is measured in seconds rather than in terms of 16th notes, 8th notes, quarter notes, which means that you can actually use a delay that is completely at odds with the musical sort of, the tempo. You might want that, so that's where you could use the delay here. Yes, whatever floats your boat. So let's just look at the next one along. Distortion, I'm going to leave that because we've got so many other things like overdrive and distortion and that sort of thing. Dynamics processor. Now, this is where you get a bit more control than the standard compressor, in that this also has an expander. You think, what's an expander? Well, actually, it's the opposite of compression. Let's just compress this. Compress the acoustic guitar track so you can hear that the compressor is kicking in. Now it's just squashing that down. That's if you've got very heavy compression. We have, in addition to attack time, which you have on the standard compressor in GarageBand, we have release as well. So if you have a slow release time, you can actually have something that is it's less pumpy. Now that's just brought that to the fore a bit better. So that's sort of woken the guitar up a little bit. Although it is way, way over the top in terms of the effect, but in some ways it's better to show the extreme effect so you can hear really what it's doing. Now, expander, what does that do? Well, I was basically playing the guitar, so I was going ding, ding, ding. Every offbeat was slightly quieter, but I'd like it to be quieter still, and that's where your expander comes in. So if I just bring the ratio up, and I think that is a decibel ratio, but it doesn't say, it's the only one that doesn't, so I'm not sure quite what that means. So now, what I'm talking about is a ratio, of course. There isn't a scale. Now, I'm going to take the compressor away to use the expander. At the moment, you can't hear anything because it's basically trying to widen something far, far too much. So we need to bring the threshold down a bit so it's dealing with the program material. So you can hear that it's actually tried to impart more dynamic or more of a difference than I played rather than less of one, which is what the compressor does. So that may be useful to you. Don't know. Anyway. Moving on. High pass filter, high shelf filter, iPod EQ, low pass filter, low shelf filter. I'm going to miss out the high pass and the high shelf for the moment. And I'm going to go to the low pass filter because this is the most sort of commonly used filter. So let's just look at that. Two controls. Cutoff frequency and resonance. Now this, to those of you who play synths or, have used the Alchemy synth, resonance, there'll be some resonance there. Hey, see what I did? So what the cutoff frequency does is it essentially takes all the treble off the guitar. So if I just ramp it up to the top, no change. Now, I'm just going to solo out the guitar so that we can hear this a bit better without the drums and the bass in the background. But you should always try things in context. Don't spend too much time soloing something because you might get the sound and then put it back in the mix and think, oh, I don't like that. So try to do stuff in context, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to do it soloed. Okay, So the cutoff frequency is from 20 to 20,000. If I bring the cutoff frequency all the way to the left, all you'll hear is the bass content of this, which is not really of any use. However, you can do that if you've got somebody playing, I don't know, a bass drum and it's a very noisy microphone or something. You can get rid of the noise and still allow the bass content through with the cutoff frequency control. So there is a way of cutting the sort of the bits that you don't want out. So resonance, basically where the cutoff frequency occurs, you can apply a resonant filter to that and it will be at whatever frequency you see here. So if I bring this down and the resonance right up, at 808 Hz, I've accidentally chanced upon the note G, and this is what key the tune is in. You could use this to your advantage. Now, the only chord that didn't have a G in was that D chord because it's got F sharp instead, and therefore you couldn't hear the resonance on that fourth chord. Use that to your advantage. You can have negative resonance as well, and you think, well, what does that mean? In practice, what it does is the cutoff frequency, if you've got the treble here and the bass over here, so I'm doing this for camera specifics, you've got bass and treble like this. The filter essentially does this. So it cuts off frequencies, but there's a certain curve. And what the negative resonance will do is actually make that curve even more gentle. And in practice, it gives you a finer control over the cutoff than if there was if the resonance was 0. If I just give you a demo of that. It's all sort of positioned at one end. If I take the resonance all the way down, you get a much more gentle curve because actually it's like that instead of like that. So, I don't know if you could see that on the camera, it sort of does that instead of that. Moving on. There's the low pass filter. Now, I'm going to actually, I'm not going to do low shelf, I'm going to do high shelf filter because actually you'll notice more of a difference with the acoustic guitar here. High shelf filter is what you get on a hi-fi system when you've got bass and treble. That's a bass. The bass is a low shelf filter and the treble is a high shelf. What that means is if you've got your frequency band here in the middle, so you've got your bass once again and your treble this side, what it does is at a certain frequency it lifts up and then shelves off and then ramps off. Hence the term shelf, because if you keep going like that, you're boosting radio frequencies and dogs will run screaming down the street. So the high shelf filter actually just prevents the bass or the treble just running away with itself at the extreme ends of the spectrum. So high shelf filter, 10,000 Hertz, and we've got a gain control. On a hi-fi system, the cutoff frequency will be fixed, but the gain is plus treble or minus treble. All of this offers much, much more than the visual EQ that you have on GarageBand in the main effects. The cutoff frequency of 10,000 Hertz, which is the lowest, can be varied all the way up to your 22,050 Hertz. Now, for those of you who are of a certain age, myself included, as you go up, the effect is very negligible. If I just give you a demo of the cutoff frequency at 10,000 Hertz, Let's ramp it up to 15 or 16. I can still hear the difference. It's very much more subtle because, of course, the microphone on the iPad isn't going to be fantastic at these sort of frequencies either. But the higher up you go, the less of an effect it has. So you could get rid of something that's, if you've got a really high sort of squeak or something on your mic, or there's something wrong with the instrument, you can use this to correct that. So actually, what I said just now about ignoring the low shelf filter, actually I am going to use it because I want to give that guitar a bit more bass. So, where are we? Low shelf. There we go. This time, we have at the other end of the spectrum, towards the bass end, towards your 20 hertz, we had 20k over here, or 20,000. On a hi-fi system, generally speaking, your bass will be probably 100 hertz as a shelving filter, and the treble is 10,000 hertz. It might be 80 and 12,000, for example, for your bass and your treble. And that's what we've got here. We've got 80 hertz, but that's quite low. There's not much low end on this acoustic guitar, so I don't want to boost lots and lots of really muddy frequencies. And you've got to be careful to notch out stuff that's right at the bottom end. Now, more on that in a minute. If I bring the cutoff frequency up to maybe, I don't know, 140 hertz, and then ramp the gain up, the guitar will have a bit more body. That's sounding a bit better, and it might tie in with those bass and the drums a bit better. See, that's without it. That's suddenly woken the bottom end of this up a little bit better. Now, but beware. If we go into Visual EQ, you could actually use this to notch out the very bassiest frequencies without affecting the body that I just applied with that other EQ. Having two equalizers is possible by doing this as well. Usually you just have your visual EQ and that's it. Whereas with the filter or any of these other tone controls that are in audio units, you can add an extra one, meaning you've essentially got two equalizers. Yeah, of course, you can go over the top with this, and beware of boosting anything too much, because we are in the digital domain here, and if you go above a certain level, the whole thing will just bottom out and it sound terrible. So you've got to be very, very careful. Now, moving on, we've got the low shelf filter. Now, I'm going to go and have a look at some of these other equalizers. Remember what I was saying just now about cutting very low frequencies. NBand EQ. Let's have a look at that. Now, there are a load of controls, and because we've got this little dot here, there are a few pages. You think, oh my goodness me, what's going on? What's going on? I accidentally notched that gain as well. Just go that on the way back. Now, we've got the global gain at the top. That's going to be useful to you if you do a lot of boosting, because you can take the global gain down and avoid that clipping problem that I mentioned just now. We've got bypass type frequency gain bandwidth, bypass type frequency gain bandwidth, bypass frequency gain bandwidth. So there are 5 things, I think, and there may even be more. Hang on, let's have a look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Ooh. Now, we've got under type parametric. Now I'm going to deal with this first. Parametric EQ is a bit like a mid band, where you can specify a frequency that you either boost or you cut, and how wide the bandwidth is. Remember the bandpass filter just now. So if I just frequency 40 hertz, that's extremely low. Let's try 1 kilohertz. 1620, that'll do, that's fine. Now if I play back that guitar and then tweak the gain of this, you can hear that I've got basically a mid boost or mid cut. When you don't hear anything, we've got the bypass here. Now, rather oddly, bypass is 1 or 0. So 1 meaning on, 0 meaning off. Not really sure why they couldn't put on or off. But 0 means that this is now going to work. So if I go back to 0 dB, play the same thing again, you'll hear the difference. It's affecting only half an octave, or 600 cents worth at the moment. Bandwidth, 0.49 of an 8 VE. 8 VE is short for octave, so half an octave. If I ramp the bandwidth up a bit, that frequency that I was boosting, or that I was selecting there, will become a little bit more general rather than specific. Whereas if I set the bandwidth very narrow, it becomes more of a resonant filter, really. So that's what you can do with this. Now, if I wanted to maybe get rid of the extreme bass end, I could either use a low shelf filter, or I could look at some of this stuff. Butterworth low pass, Butterworth high pass, resonant low pass, resonant high pass, bandpass. There's masses going on. Now, a Butterworth filter is an analog filter, and there are actually several stages. It doesn't actually say whether it's a second order or third order filter. This is from my days of electronics. But essentially it's an analog filter that's meant to sort of mimic how that would work, rather than a digital one, which is more capable but arguably less musical. So let's try Butterworth low pass. Sorry, Butterworth high pass for getting rid of your bass. There we go. So I want to basically notch out everything below about 80 Hertz here, so that I haven't got any nasty rumble from my guitar. There we go. Now, as you can see, the gain and the bandwidth, essentially, they basically disabled when I'd selected this, because it's only got your two controls. You've got bypass, you've got a high pass filter and the frequency. So the gain is irrelevant because it's actually cutting rather than doing any boosting. So that's why it changed to there. Resonant high, that's basically, it just means that there is a high pass filter. You can't select the bandwidth. It's basically saying high pass. So and that's meant to basically simulate an analog circuit. Let's have a look at low shelf, for example. We've got the low shelf filter, which we had in the other, but now the difference being here that this is one of 7 things that you can select. So actually this is much more powerful as an equalizer, but also you can get into really quite hot water when you're trying to search through stuff and make changes. Now, if you save the GarageBand song and come back in, it won't remember anything. None of these audio units remember the settings. Now, that is in the description box below, and there's a very good video by Pete Johns from South Australia, who's basically come up with essentially a very clever way of remembering your settings. You basically merge the track. Go and have a look at the steps on his video, and he can show you how to do it. So there's your frequency for low shelf. Now, looking at these other things, we've got resonant low shelf. Remember the resonance that we had before. So there are many things here. But generally speaking, this is an EQ where you'd use the parametric. And that's why it's the top of the menu, because it's kind of what it's intended to do. So as I said before, your parametric EQ, you can select the bandwidth in terms of octaves, or the frequency, and the gain, whether it's boosting or cutting. Now, moving on. There's your NBand EQ. We also have a parametric that's on its own. If I go into that, there we go. We've just got your three things. Now, Q. You think, well, what's Q? Basically, this is similar to a bandwidth. It's called quality factor. And this is more akin to an old school mixing desk that might have a quality factor that goes from maybe 1 to 100. Now, the Q factor, oh, look at that, 1 to 20. Where 20 is more selective, and actually an analog mixing desk would never, ever be capable of a Q factor of 100. So, if I just play guitar through this. With a quality factor of 20, I'm really only affecting this frequency and very close ones around it. Now, the way an analog filter works is that you can't boost one frequency without affecting stuff around it. And actually, no digital filter does that either, because there's no point. There's absolutely no point in it at all. So if I just go back to 670, that's in the body of the guitar, you can hear the difference with a high Q factor and a low one. There we go. Now, I've been boosting a lot here. You can also cut this. If you've got an annoying frequency on the guitar, you can cut it out. If you set the Q factor high, it means that it won't affect everything else too much. And actually, when you cut, the effect is less pronounced when you have a higher Q. But a lower Q will scoop it out much more. Play with these at your leisure. Now, although Pete has obviously done that video of how to essentially save your settings, you could use a good old pen and paper, or you could take screenshots of this. Maybe, I don't know, do whatever it takes to remember those settings, and it only takes a couple of seconds to do it. But really, this is kind of at the end of your mix. Okay, moving on. We've got audio unit extensions. We've got a few other things here. We've got a pitch corrector, or pitch, not a pitch corrector, a pitch shifter. We'll leave that. That's like the vocal shifter. Play with it at your pleasure. So, peak limiter. Now, this is where we can get a bit creative with mastering. Now, at the moment, it's only on the guitar track, but what you could do is once you've merged a track, you could put the peak limiter. You could put the whole thing through peak limiter. Peak limiter is essentially a very, very high ratio compressor, and it essentially allows you to really flat the thing out, and it will essentially remove a lot of the dynamics. Yeah. Now, what we can do is we can actually merge the entire thing. In fact, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to merge this, and this together to create an audio mix of my session. And now it appears as a single track. Now, let's see what happens if I use going into here, get rid of Effect EQ, and instead select my peak limiter. Now, this is not a brilliant way to do this. If you are really serious about mastering, download the Final Touch program. It's it's a few quid, a few dollars, a few yen, a few Australian dollars, a few Canadian dollars, a few New Zealand dollars. You get the picture, a few rand. But it is very, very worthwhile having, because you can do all sorts of other things. This is kind of a get out of jail free version, but it's fine. So just moving on, I'll just find the copy. There we go. So it's basically the one it copied before it sort of then ruined the mix that I had just now. Now let's go back. Oh, and you can see that it didn't save my limiting on the guitar there, because I've closed the song and reopened it. So just moving on to I think it's the final one now. Let's have a look. Sample delay. Now, if you have latency issues, or there's something that's recorded and you think, oh, it's a bit sluggish, this is where the sample delay comes in. And it actually, what it does is essentially it's the same thing as moving one of your audio tracks along, but it's very fine control. In to out delay. 4,410, that's 1/10 of a second, because 44,100 samples is 1 second. So this is a very, very fine control. Now if I put this on guitar with the maximum delay, of course, the original track isn't very in time, but actually I didn't mind it with a little bit of a delay. Because even though the track wasn't recorded very well, it's sitting a bit better on that snare drum. So this is something where you can play with the groove a little bit. Now, just before we finish, thinking about the delay here, if we go on the drums, I'll just switch that off so we're back. There we go. I'm going to just solo the drums out, and I'm going to play with the delay, because this is an extra way of getting a bit more of a sort of a groove out of the drums. Here we go. Now, at the moment, the delay will be 1 second. You can hear what it's doing to those hi-hats already. Now, if we play with the delay time a bit, go back to the beginning so that we've got 0% feedback or a tiny little feedback at the moment. There we go, something like that. How about that? We've got a sort of we've got a sort of a swing groove there. Now this works best when you've got single hits. I don't mind that. However, will it work with what we've just done? No, it's not brilliant. So if I re-record a guitar part that went with that, the bass part is fairly mundane, so it's not going to affect that too much. Let's try that. So it's a very good way of actually humanizing those drums. Now, in the drum rhythms, you can have 8th swing light, 8th swing heavy, 16th light, 16th heavy. Actually, by using a delay on those drums of a completely sort of tweakable amount, you can start really getting some quite neat drum grooves in with that. So there's a little overview into some of those audio effect plugins, those audio units. They're really useful, and there's masses you can do with them.